everyone, I'm Rania Kalik with Breakthrough News. Welcome to our brand new show, Overlap, a collaboration with our friends at Wave Media, a private media house in China. Overlap is a global conversation show with a rotating set of hosts in the US and China, brought in to discuss life, politics, and culture in our respective countries, to push back against the Cold War atmosphere that seeks to isolate, demonize, and punish. For our very first episode, I discussed Taiwan with Albert Wang, a key opinion leader across Chinese social media. So Albert, I'm so excited to be on with you. How are you?
Yeah, great. I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so happy to be here to talk about Taiwan. This is going to be a great conversation.
Oh yeah, looking for it.
I'm curious, because one thing that did get a lot of attention recently about Taiwan was Nancy Pelosi's visit. I'm curious, how did Nancy Pelosi's visit impact the Chinese general public? What did they want the government to do in response, and why did they see it as so provocative?
Very, very good question. But I want to answer you by telling a story first.
Please.
The American Civil War, the North, fought under President Lincoln in the hope of securing the unity of the country. But the Confederacy in the South gained the support of Great Britain. The war had nothing to do with Britain, but now Britain intervened. Let us suppose that if Britain had not only intervened, but the Speaker of the British Parliament had visited the Confederacy, specifically and made a public speech saying that the Confederacy was a nation, what would the Americans think? This is what most of the people in China think of Nancy Pelosi's visit to the island of Taiwan. I could see that everyone around me was talking about it, including my family members. This topic went viral in every kind of media. I guess Pelosi has never gotten so much global attention before that. Many people have even been following her trip on all those kind of flight apps since she got on the plane. And Weibo, which is the Chinese version of Twitter, collapsed for several times just because too many netizens were talking about her trip and tracking her flight, and the internet was overloaded. So when she landed on Taiwan safely, there was a huge fury on social media, not only toward Pelosi, but also toward the government, since people see it as a national shame and the government only made harsh statements. So when I was a student in the US, I had so many American friends, both from conservative sides and the liberal sides. They told me that they didn't like Nancy Pelosi. Now the Chinese people don't like her neither. She is kind of infamous on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. And some people have even taken to the internet to call for the military to shoot her down, seriously. So because for us, the economic and cultural exchange between the mainland and Taiwan are very frequent. Many people in Taiwan are studying, working, living, and doing business on the mainland. So we know that we have political problems, but there is also a tacit agreement on both sides to ensure peace. Even the US government has actually been saying that it doesn't want either side to change the status quo. But Pelosi's visit forced Beijing to respond to the Taiwan question, and any response will lead to instability. If Beijing responds, then Taipei will have to respond. And if Taipei responds, Beijing will certainly have to respond again. And eventually, things will escalate. No one knows where the end is. So I have watched so many, just like you mentioned earlier, I have also watched so many American mainstream media coverage of this event. And whether it's liberal media such as MSNBC, CNN, or conservative media such as Fox News, they're all playing up China as a peace breaker in this case. But it's very clear that Pelosi is the one who is bent to going ahead, despite very, very, very clear warning from Beijing. From my knowledge, the US media is very contradictory to domestic issues. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to China, their positions suddenly become so consistent. Here's my question: why? How can they act similarly on this issue?
Yeah, that's a great point because, of course, the mainstream media in the West does like to have different positions on certain domestic issues. There'll be like a sort of liberal conservative divide when, with things like abortion or with things like, I don't know, culture war issues like LGBTQ rights, these sort of things. But then when it comes to the issue of Taiwan, they all take the same position. And I think, it's important to understand the American media landscape plays a huge role here because 90% of US media is controlled by just 5 corporations. So that means most of the media in the US is in the hands of the ruling elites, right? And ruling elites in America, they're all invested in maintaining American domination over the world. I mean, that's why they are like the elites of the world. They're invested in maintaining American imperialism. So that's why the corporations, the media that own media, that's why they almost always echo the State Department because they're on the same side, they're on the same page, whether it's on, Taiwan or Xinjiang or Iran or Ukraine. It's the same exact thing that they're saying. So, and this also speaks to the fact that China's rise as an economic powerhouse challenges that American dominance, right? It scares them. So by extension, you see the US empire's anxieties about that reflected in mainstream media coverage of China. But that said, there are ruling class differences about how they want to deal with China, And here I'm speaking like some Democrats versus some Republicans don't have the same position on how China should be dealt with. Republicans have a much harder, they think China is sort of like the center of all evil, whereas Democrats see China as part of a larger problem of groups of countries, of adversaries, pushing back against U.S. hegemony. So that's why you'll also see China used as the scapegoat. Like I mentioned earlier, especially with the issue of jobs going overseas, because that happened because of corporate greed, but the Republicans will frame it as happening because of China or because of Mexican immigrants or something. But the point is that that's why when you watch American media, you will see some slight nuances, like on MSNBC versus Fox News. On Fox News, there'll be a much more explicitly anti-China sentiment, much more racist, openly racist, because Fox News is like basically a far-right channel. Whereas MSNBC will couch a lot of the anti-China rhetoric in the language of human rights and democracy. So you'll see a difference in even how they portray China to their specific audiences, because liberals, Democrats are technically liberals, they do, react better to the idea of, we have to save people, human rights, that sort of liberal interventionist rhetoric. Whereas with Republicans and on Fox News, it's much more like you should hate China because they're stealing your jobs and because they're scary and they're backwards. So that's, kind of like the divide you'll see. But again, I want to go back to emphasize, like, America is a corporate-run state. It's an oligarchic state. And the media is not free when 90% of it is owned by corporations. That said, it's also important to note that, according to a recent poll, the vast majority of Americans don't trust the mainstream media. Only 11% even watch cable news right now. So a lot of people are going online to get information. And that's where I think it's important to recognize there's a lot of independent media in the US. We have to deal with a lot of algorithmic suppression, which really sucks. But also it does open up this opportunity to present a different view. So you do get to, it depends where you're getting your media from. But if you're going online and you're coming across like Empire Files or Breakthrough News or one of these channels, you might end up seeing, someone like you. And that's how someone like your voice, gets heard in the media. And then it kind of breaks that sort of bipartisan anti-China view that seems to run the entire, narrative on cable news. I was just saying that luckily, like, we have independent media outlets that are online that are able to fill the void because there are a lot of people who don't trust the mainstream media anymore. They know they're being lied to, especially after like the wars in Iraq and then what happened in Libya and then Syria. And then just there's a sentiment of we know we're being lied to. So people tend to go online. They don't believe CNN anymore. They don't believe MSNBC or Fox News. They're, especially younger people, they're getting their media from the internet. They're getting their media from YouTube. So that does give people like organizations like Breakthrough News an opportunity to sort of break through that bipartisan, narrative of China, Russia, Iran, Syria. All these countries are bad and out to get you. So we can present views like yours, Albert, and others. So Albert, one, because as far as Americans are concerned, they only hear the really propagandistic, like hawkish American side. And I think here would be a good place to maybe explain to us, some of the history that Americans don't know about with regard to the island and its relationship to mainland China.
Yeah, I'm really happy to share about the history because it's very important, I think. Because Taiwan actually has been a part of Chinese sovereignty for a very, very, very long time. Actually, in 1644, the Qing dynasty replaced the Ming dynasty. The audience, you guys watching this show, you guys don't have to understand these two dynasties. They're just two dynasties in the ancient Chinese history. Yeah, but when the Qing dynasty replaced the Ming dynasty, there were some Ming generals entered the island of Taiwan in 1661 and established a regional warlord regime that ruled for 23 years before being defeated by the Qing dynasty. By that time, I want to mention that, by that time, even the United States did not even exist. Since then, the Qing dynasty sent officials to govern the island, and in 1885, Taiwan was officially upgraded to a province of China. So after 1840, the Qing dynasty was invaded by the Western powers such as UK, France, Germany, things like that, and became very, very weak. While Japan, like everyone knows, which was rapidly getting stronger and stronger after the Meiji Restoration, wanted to get involved in exploiting China. So it started a war in 1894 and took over Taiwan as a colony. In 1912, revolutionaries overthrew the Qing dynasty and monarchy, established a new regime called the Republic of China. Later on, the country joined the Allies under this name to fight the Japanese during World War II, and Taiwan was restored to China after the war. But at home, this government lacked the ability to unify China, and there were a large number of warlords throughout China. So in the memory of the Chinese people, the Republic of China was a very, very corrupt government that was willing to sell out the national interest in order to get foreign support like money, weapons to fight the civil wars. And so many people died in civil wars. So as a result, some revolutionaries established the Communist Party of China in 1921 and eventually succeeded in overthrowing the government of Republic of China, led by Kuomintang, which means the Nationalist Party of China, in 1949. The communists lacked a strong navy, so the Kuomintang managed to escape to Taiwan with the protection of the powerful US Navy. So let's be very clear at here. When Taiwan was restored to China after the World War II, it is not saying that Taiwan would be given to a specific regime, but to the Chinese sovereignty. So whichever government can lawfully represent China has every right over Taiwan. It doesn't matter its name is the Republic of China before 1949 or the People's Republic of China after 1949. So for us, the Taiwan question is entirely domestic, but the presence of the Americans interrupted our process of unifying the country. So here is my share of the history part. So Ronnie, I really want to know this event. Actually, I know this event has generated some discussion in the US. And I watched some videos about the Taiwan question made by American YouTubers, which got a lot of hits. So I wonder if American people, general American people, know where Taiwan is. And do they really care about Taiwan?
No, that's a very good question. And, I think there was a recent Morning Consult survey in the beginning of August, actually, that found that about 66% of Americans could not find Taiwan on a map. So a majority of Americans don't actually know where Taiwan is. And this poll actually coincided with a deluge of media coverage about Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. And what's interesting about this poll, though, is that there was 34% of Americans who actually did find Taiwan on a map. But interestingly enough, they took this small minority of Americans that knew where Taiwan was, actually took a more hawkish view of U.S. policy around Taiwan. About 76% of them supported the U.S. recognizing Taiwan, and 56% said the U.S. should be responsible for Taiwan's protection militarily. But of course, that's a minority of Americans. Among the general population, only 46% of American voters supported the U.S. militarily protecting Taiwan. But the point to raise all this is just to say, that it's important to recognize that most Americans do not take the hawkish view. But what was also interesting about that poll is that that minority that could find Taiwan on the map and had that more hawkish view, they reported watching more media coverage of Pelosi's visit, meaning they were really just reacting to what the media was telling them about Taiwan. And there was also like a recent Economist YouGov poll after Pelosi's visit that found that a plurality of Americans that were polled, about 39%, felt that Pelosi should not have visited Taiwan. So that's important too. Not a majority, but a plurality. The majority actually weren't sure how they felt about it because they're still a little confused about Taiwan. As for whether Americans really care about Taiwan, it's really US politicians and ruling elites who care about Taiwan. Average Americans, it really depends on how much media they're watching and what kind of media they're watching. But for the most part, when you poll Americans about what they care about, the issue of Taiwan is not coming up on top, and neither is the issue of China. It's generally domestic issues about the economy, anxieties about the economy. The majority of Americans feel that the United States is heading in the wrong direction. And so we have to understand a lot of the American sentiments that you might see in the media about Taiwan are a reflection of what the media and what their politicians are telling them. And it also has a lot to do with the media and ruling elites trying to scapegoat the inequality that exists in America by blaming outside actors, whether it's Russia or China, but it's really, again, about what the corporate media is telling them to care about. So I just want to emphasize Americans are not a monolith when it comes to these issues. And lastly, I'll point out, there's a growing group of anti-war Americans, a growing sentiment of anti-war feeling in America, especially after the disasters in Iraq and Libya and Syria. And there are a lot of groups that are working to oppose this new Cold War with China and trying to tell people about the truth about Taiwan and other issues, whether it's Hong Kong or Xinjiang or all these different issues the US tries to invoke to get the population to care about this Cold War with China. We have groups like the Party for Socialism and Liberation, groups like Pivot to Peace, No Cold War, Code Pink. And, these are just the ones coming off the top of my head. And then there's a lot of independent media outlets too, like Breakthrough News, where I work, and other places that are trying to build consciousness around this issue and really trying to connect, the struggles between what's happening at home with struggles abroad to show that, this anti-China stuff is really all about just maintaining the wealth of ruling elites in the belly of the beast in U.S. empire. And it actually hurts average Americans. It increases anti-Asian racism in the U.S. It feeds into white supremacy, and it distracts from the fact that our problems are rooted in American empire and capitalism and imperialism, not in what China is doing. And, in this era of like existential crises, like increasing climate catastrophes, we need global cooperation more than ever, not war. And, that sentiment does resonate with people. It's a matter of being able to reach them.
Like what you mentioned, there are like 30% of the people believe that the United States should militarily intervene the Taiwan question when there is something's going on. And as you mentioned, also they mostly hold hawkish view toward China. So I have another question: is when they talk about Taiwan, do they care Taiwan as Taiwan, or they simply just hold hawkish view toward whatever related to China?
That's a good question too. I think it's the second thing you mentioned, because like I said, for the minority of Americans who do care about Taiwan, it's really just as it relates to the US competition with China. So some Americans see it as an issue of supporting democracy because that's what media and politicians say, that Taiwan is about democracy, right? Others see it as related to this general dislike or fear of China, which you'll find more prevalent among actually Republicans than Democrats. Because right now there's a partisan divide. Democrats are more opposed. They're opposed to both. Everyone's opposed to Russia and China. And, we have like a two-party dictatorship in America. But Democrats are more opposed to Russia, right? While Republicans have a harder line against China. But of course, it's still bipartisan. But, polling on this really goes up and down. But depending on if China's in the media at the moment. But what is consistent is most Americans view China as an adversary. And of course, those with more hawkish views tend to be, whiter and older and more Republican, while those who are more likely to view Russia as an enemy tend to be like younger and Democrats. And then the Republican politicians do blame China for like stealing jobs, even though it was just corporations moving jobs overseas for cheaper labor. And that sits well with Republican voters who follow their politicians in that kind of scapegoating of China to blame them for everything. So there is this partisan divide trickling down. But, you know, as far as Americans are concerned with the specifics, they don't know much about Taiwan. So I'm glad you got to explain that history because they don't especially understand the history of Taiwan. But I did want to actually ask you a question.
Yeah.
You know, I'm curious, speaking of like the war in Ukraine, where we've gotten a very one-sided narrative in the US, I'm curious if the war in Ukraine has affected the way that Chinese people view the Taiwan issue. Like as a result of this, are people in the Chinese public like more willing to go to war over Taiwan, or is peaceful reunification still seen as a very real possibility?
Well, very, very good question. Of course, we care about this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but it has nothing to do with Taiwan question. At the very beginning, the people have very, very mixed feeling about Russia-Ukrainian conflict. Internationally, the United States has been suppressing Russia and China, resulting in better China-Russia relations. And from a realist point of view, China and Russia need support from each other. However, things shifted when Western media and politicians brought the Taiwan question up. Many of them tried to portray the Taiwan question as an Eastern Asian replica of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, describing Taiwan as Ukrainian, Beijing as Russia. As I watched some American YouTubers did the same thing. And our attempts to unify the country and they also try to portray our attempts to unify the country as an aggression. Then some Taiwan secessionists started to pray the West on TV and play up the China threat theory with the West. They created this atmosphere that Beijing will start a war with Taiwan, just like Russia invaded Ukraine. Pompeo, former U.S. Secretary of State and a maybe potential presidential candidate in 2 years, and he
scary.
He openly said that the U.S. should diplomatically recognize Taiwan as a free and sovereign country since the Ukraine war started. There is even a tag trending on social media. Today is Ukraine, tomorrow's Taiwan. And the leader of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, praised Ukraine's courage in fighting for democracy and their independence and donated her salary to support Ukraine. I mean, it all made the people on mainland very, very, very mad. So there were some people started to side with Russia and showing very, very negative feeling to Ukraine. Of course, I mean, because the enemy of the enemy is a friend and the friend of the enemy is an enemy, right? Very basic rule in international games. But over time, there was also an emotional shift here. Some people thought that Ukrainians were just too pro-Western, so they were beaten up by Russia. So they had no sympathy for Ukraine at all. They felt all pro-Western people deserve to be beaten up, including secessionists in Taiwan. So here's the thing. So the United States is also a very significant factor in this event and all the things after. So there's a lot of Chinese also believe that the United States will make instability in order to maintain military hegemony. So on the Taiwan question, for example, the Chinese believe that if the mainland and the island of Taiwan could keep deepening our engagement, then eventually we could achieve peaceful reunification. But the U.S. has continued to interfere in the Taiwan question, selling arms to Taiwan's secessionists and giving them promise of mutual defense, leading those people to have illusions about the U.S. intervention and be willing to confront Beijing. So the island of Taiwan used to be largely populated by veterans of the Kuomintang who went to Taiwan from the mainland. But as these people are becoming older and older, and some of them are passed away, the most of the younger generation, the younger people, they were born and raised in Taiwan as a secessionist regime. So many people believe the window for a peaceful reunification is slowly shutting down. Some are very, very pessimistic. They believe that the Chinese people on both sides will eventually fight each other, and they blame it. They think it is the fault of the United States. Therefore, I know that many Western media try to portray China as a scary and powerful country, but in fact, the Chinese people know very well that the United States is the key point, is the most powerful country in the world, and that we are not a match for the United States militarily. And simply two countries with nuclear weapons going to war would definitely not be a very good choice for the world or for any side.
I think a lot of times, Albert, that a lot of times the American elites are just projecting their own behaviors onto their adversaries. So they assume because they want to conquer the world and they want to dominate the world, that anybody else who becomes powerful will also want the same thing. So I think it's also a matter of projection, but I agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, that's why I feel kind of worried when you say, and actually I know this trend in American politics, that there are so many politicians are trying to provoking and making people to feel that China is a very scary adversary to the United States and to American hegemony, because I don't see where it goes. I don't see where it goes because, like I mentioned, two countries with nuclear weapons going to war. It doesn't sound very realistic, right? But
well, it sounds scary. Is what
Yeah.
It sounds scary, like something that we should avoid at all costs.
That's why in China, even though, like you mentioned, that most of the media, 90% of the media in the United States are controlled by 5 private corporations. The United States, especially when I see some the congressman making speech in Congress, they're keep saying things just like the Roman senator Cato keeps saying that, oh, carnage will have to be destroyed, things like that. That makes me very worried. So do you know anyone in American military, or do you know anyone who has family or friends in the military? What is their view on this issue?
Yeah, so I know some people in the military. I also have some extended family in the military. Something to understand about the American military is that it's volunteer. But that's kind of deceiving because really, here, I'll start like this. In my experience, those people who at least I come into contact with in the military, they tend to have the same views as the general US population. And it goes down that sort of partisan divide as well. So it depends what party they align with. But there is sometimes more skepticism among people in the military because they would be the ones who would be deployed to go fight any sort of war. And so, like I mentioned, it's a volunteer military, right? Which means that, some people join the military because they see themselves as these American patriots protecting the country. But a lot of other people join the military because they come from poor working class backgrounds, and it's a pathway to a free college education or free healthcare, which are things the rest of the population do not get for free. These things in America cost so much money. You did a sort of teaser episode with Rachel from Breakthrough News where you talked about the issue of college education. And in America, most people have crazy levels of student loans they're paying off. So for people who can't afford access to college, they might join the military. So that segment of the population that joins the military for that reason, from them, there may be more of an open attitude of skepticism towards new military adventures. Because again, they're the ones who would be deployed. And this is especially the case after Iraq and Afghanistan, where you do have more questioning of the US ruling class's desire to constantly send other people's kids to go fight their wars. because again, it's them who have to fight. And then there's also like people who are in the military who then become like veterans of various wars who become opposed to war. And those people, I think, are some of the most powerful voices because they also joined the military for the reasons I mentioned. And then they got deployed, off to Iraq or Afghanistan, and they saw that it was all a big lie. Like they're being told that they're going to defend American freedoms and democracy, but what they're doing in these places is incredibly anti-democratic, is incredibly violent, and has nothing to do with protecting Americans. And so I think that, if you might have a sentiment that sees China as an adversary or an enemy because of the propaganda, but I think that if the U.S. actually were to attempt to send soldiers, American soldiers anywhere, around this issue, there would be a lot of pushback, I think, from even people inside the military. It's my turn. Yeah, it's my turn, Albert. So I want to ask you.
Okay.
When it comes to the Chinese public, how does the Chinese general public view Americans? I mean, you kind of alluded to it a little bit, but are Americans, like just average Americans, seen as separate from the government? Or are Americans seen as responsible for the government's aggression since the U.S. boasts about having this democracy where we elect officials? Which way is it? And I'm sure there's not one view in China, but if you had to describe.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because like what you say, the U.S. government constantly claims to be the leader of the free world and has a monopoly on the right to define democracy. It is even sending people to other countries to monitor their elections, checking if they meet the American definition of democracy. Since this is the case, of course, many Chinese who do not understand American politics believe that the U.S. government is elected by the American people, so the action of the U.S. government are supported by the American people. But of course, there are more Chinese people who see Americans as separate from the government. For example, we also feel very, very sorry for American people when the death toll of the COVID-19 in the U.S. reached 1 million, as well as the mass shooting and the drug problems and all the other problems. Some people in China see Americans are being kidnapped by the government and its political system. I want to ask this question again, that even when the politicians and all the mainstream media keeps saying that that China is an adversary, did the U.S. seriously consider on the likelihood of a war with China? Would its people go to war with China to support Taiwan especially when we're especially talking about Taiwan question today? So will people especially go to war to support Taiwan for this reason? I mean, maybe some of the very, very hawkish people would say that, I would go to war with China to protect American hegemony. But will they go to war with China simply because saying that, I want to support Taiwan? I mean,
So, right now, a minority of Americans support military intervention to protect Taiwan, which I mentioned earlier. And I think, again, I want to reemphasize, it really is politicians who promote the idea of intervening in Taiwan. Americans are not sitting around their kitchen tables thinking about Taiwan and China. Like they're thinking about, how am I going to afford gasoline? They're thinking about, how am I going to afford my electricity bill? They're thinking of, oh my God, I hope I don't have a medical emergency, because a majority of Americans are one medical emergency away from bankruptcy because our medical system is such a disaster and it's privatized. So whether the U.S. would do it, though, it's hard to say. The U.S. is always preparing to go to war with any of its adversaries at any time. It's always doing these war games, which I'm sure get reported on in China. They know they don't have the capacity to actually fight a war with China over Taiwan because they're limited geographically. Like Taiwan is right next to China. It is China, right? Whereas the US is on the other side of the world. So that people who actually plan war understand that they don't have the geography or the manpower. So what they do plan for, and what they're openly saying, in the media is they talk about supporting Taiwan militarily to fight a proxy war with China, the way that they've done with Ukraine. We even heard a few months ago, military officials actually telling the Taiwanese leadership to prepare for what they called the Ukraine scenario. But this is how America fights wars now. It doesn't send in the army. Like the last time the US sent in the army was Iraq in 2003. I mean, there's like special operations forces here and there, but that's small and that's usually secretive. But in terms of actually invading a place or going, sending hundreds of thousands of troops, like most Americans wouldn't support that. US leadership knows that. So that's why the wars in like Syria and Libya, these were proxy wars where the US, sends weapons and has other people, like other nationalities, fight and die to protect American interests rather than even Americans. And I think that the reason for that is because there would be so little support from the American public for actually sending in American troops to go fight a war, whether it's in China or Iran or in Russia. And, sadly, that's why you see what you're seeing in Ukraine right now, where literally America is fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. So yeah, I guess my answer to your question is I don't think Americans would support a direct military confrontation with China. That's the last thing on their minds. There's way more, happening in America, whether we're talking about inequality, lack of healthcare, COVID deaths, which are still piling up, that's going on in the United States that people care about before they care about going to war with some country on the other side of the world. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I actually want to share a story. Isn't related to the Taiwan question, but as what you mentioned before, and I know that some people, even some of my friends, joined the U.S. military for better education, better healthcare, and even I even know some Chinese students join the military for green card. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was interesting.
That's actually I mentioned I had some extended family members who have joined the military, and actually that was the reason is to get a green card. Yeah, access to a green card.
As what you mentioned, wars are very expensive. I agree with that, and I believe that the U.S. government, I don't know if it is Biden or Trump, say that the war in Afghanistan or Iraq cost more than 2,000 billion American dollars. And
crazy.
Yeah, and I also remember that specifically that Trump's team in 2016 openly declared that it will cost 1,000 billion American dollars to refresh all the infrastructures throughout the country, throughout the United States. Think about it. When you can spend like half of the money, but refresh all the infrastructures throughout the country, how many jobs will it create? How many GDP will it create? And you don't have to sacrifice a life overseas by killing other people. How great it is.
Yeah, Albert, it's crazy because, it's in no one's interest. It's in no one's interest on the planet to have a war between the US and China, whether it's over Taiwan or any other issue. But the US is this vast military empire that just needs to continue to expand and has this it needs to just control everything. And again, China's existence as anything but a submissive state, just like any other country, as far as US empire sees it, is a threat to that domination. And so it's these crazy war hawks. It's the Mike Pompeos of the world. And also the Joe Bidens. I mean, it's a bipartisan issue, but it's in their interest, as they see it, to go to war with China. But it is not in the interests of Americans. It's not in the interest of Chinese. And it's not in the interest of anybody around the world, again, especially as we face these horrible crises that are taking place, whether it's the threat of more pandemics or climate change. So I am really happy that we get to talk about this stuff. And I hope that this, helps people understand and recognize that, because we actually have way more in common than we don't. I actually did want to ask you though, I think it's so interesting that you went to high school and college in the US.
Yeah.
So that must have been an interesting experience for you. I'm curious, like, what was your perception of the United States? What were some of your personal experiences dealing with Americans and their views on Taiwan and the Cold War with China? Did you get a chance to just like talk to the people that you came into contact with about those things?
Totally. Because I found out that American people are very fond of talking politics. Especially when I was in college. Especially I majored in political science. So I guess that's why so many of my friends were very fond of talking politics. Actually, I went to the United States for high school and college, and I remember the first time I saw a world map in an American classroom. Taiwan and mainland China were colored differently. I spent the next 10 years in America, and most of the maps I saw were basically the same. The first time I saw that map, I even argued with my teacher. But later on, I just...
How did that go? How did that argument go?
Yeah. Well, she didn't even take me seriously. She just say some reasons that I don't even remember. But yeah, later on, I even gave up. I even gave up to argue with people because since I think they're educated and they were raised in that way. Also, the US claims to be a country of free speech where people can color the maps however they want. Why would most map makers choose to color the mainland and Taiwan differently instead of coloring them in the same color? I mean, have they made this conclusion by studying Chinese history, or have they got this information simply from some sort of political propaganda? I mean, free speech should be based on free information. If American people have no access to the correct Chinese map or a map from the Chinese way, then how could they learn this information and make the real free choice of what they want to believe in? Therefore, I really hope, and like what I said to most of my friends, I really hope that more American people can pay a visit to China, learn more about China. I mean, I know that the United States are making tourist visa from China to the United States getting more and more difficult. But China are welcoming American peoples to come to China to pay a visit or just having fun. So, and China is not very expensive for American people. And China is a safe country. China is a very welcoming country. So I really hope that more American people can pay a visit to China and learn more about us. That's what I want to say.
I do. No, I hope so too. And I think that's really important to note that because, Albert, most Americans haven't left the country. A lot of Americans don't have a passport. You probably noticed that when you actually came to the United States, that a lot of Americans haven't ever been outside of the US. And that's not by accident. I mean, when you get to travel around the world and see other places, it gives you a different perspective. And Americans, we do love to talk about free speech, but we are really conditioned and indoctrinated in school to see the world in a specific way where America's at the center and everybody else is in a supporting role, right? We're the exceptional nation. Even though we were founded on slavery and genocide, we are still taught that we were founded on democracy, which is a shocking level of just dissonance. How is it even possible that you can talk about slavery and then say the founders were so brilliant and this was a democratic country? No, it was founded as basically a fascist country that erased the people who were already here and forced people to work on plantations. But, you already know about all that. But my point is just to say that when Americans do have access to the outside world, it does change their perspectives. And that's why I hope this conversation can be one of those things that makes people think, Chinese people do actually have a point. And maybe it isn't that, we're sworn enemies. And I think it's also important to recognize for your audience, for the Chinese audience, that the US, you know this, but in case you don't, the US is this empire, and empires are bullies. And the only thing protecting the US as a superpower is the fact that it has 1,000 military bases around the world, and it spends more than any other country in the world on its military. But that actually hurts its own population so much. Like, we have levels of homelessness that would shock people. You mentioned infrastructure earlier. We have like 70,000 bridges in America that are at risk of collapsing. And instead of fixing that and addressing that, our leaders are sending tens of billions of dollars. I don't even know how much. I've lost track of how much money the US has sent to Ukraine in terms of weapons to fight Russia. It's just an endless supply. And so there is so much inequality in the US. There are people standing up to it and trying to do something about it. And I actually think that the sort of potential, the revolutionary potential in the US is so high right now because of that inequality and that dissonance. So anyways, I hope that we can contribute to trying to educate and inform people about all of these things and make them see things in a different light. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. It's great to have this conversation with you. I really hope that our conversation can contribute to I really hope that we can contribute to the friendship between our people.
Yeah, that's what Overlap's all about. This is like what this show is all about. I'm glad we got to do. I'm glad we got to do this first episode on this issue, because I really think right now this is like a central issue that we're just nonstop. The media is nonstop talking about. And then hopefully there's like so many other topics that it won't just be me and it won't just be you. It'll be other people as well being able to have conversations about these things. But this was fantastic. I really appreciate that we got to do this.
Totally. Happy to talk to you this time.